In this video, we're going to take a look at the tool Zap Link inside of ZBrush, and this is going to allow us to take basically kind of like a screenshot of whatever we're looking at inside of ZBrush and send that over to a paint program like Photoshop, and then use all the tools that we're familiar with in that paint program, and then do some paint over there, and then send those results back to ZBrush and have them applied to your 3D model. So this is where the tool actually sits, this Zap Link right here under Document. Before we do that, I'm actually going to switch to a different model to do this demonstration on. So let me close down some of these things I have open over here. When you open the program, you should see this tool over here off to the right in this trough area. So I'm going to go to Subtools, and I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of the stack that I have here. And I'm going to click on this statue resurf, and that's going to load this model in the background. I'm only going to want to work with this model that I have in the background, so I can hit this solo button, and that'll hide everything else in the scene except for this thing that I'm working on. The next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to turn off perspective. I've just had better results using this tool when perspective is turned off. Okay, so to go into this tool, some things that you might want to think about before you do this. Your document size, whatever your document size is set to right here, that's what's going to be kicked over to Photoshop, or your other paint program. So I've got mine set at 1920 by 1080, and that's giving me plenty of resolution. Then the next thing I'm going to do is click on the Zap Link, and here I'm going to use this Set Target app. This is going to be the first time you use this tool. It's going to ask you to find a program that can open .psd files, so that's Photoshop files. So if you have Photoshop, you're going to have to navigate to where that sits. So after this comes up, I can just click in the background, and it'll open up this dialog box to navigate to where Photoshop sits. So on my computer, I've got a 64-bit machine, so I'll just go to System C, Program Files, Adobe, and then Adobe Photoshop CS5.1, 64-bit is what I'm using, and then scroll down, and you should find the Photoshop.exe in there. So you can go ahead and click that and set Open, and that's going to set whatever program that you wish as that target app to work with. We'll talk about some of these options here, but let's just talk about this real quick. Fade is going to put paint on the entire model, except for it will fade out and not push paint along the outer edges of whatever you see here. So I'm actually going to turn this off, and I'm going to say drop now, and that's actually should send a version of what you see on the screen over to Photoshop. So you can see here there's going to be 3 different layers that it's going to create. It's going to create a background that's got a lock on there, so that should be locked. The next one is going to be just the flat color, whatever that color is that you're working with. This is where your paint is actually stored at. And you can see it's got a layer with a layer mask, and then it's also called layer 1. So this is kind of important when you send this back to ZBrush to make sure everything's kind of in this order and your layer is flattened down to this layer 1, and this is the same name that it has. The top layer is called Z shading, and it says do not edit, and it's locked, so you wouldn't be able to do anything with that. That is just there to give you this shaded look, so you can kind of see exactly what it is that you're painting on here. So if I go ahead and if I fill with a color that is maybe a little bit darker than this, maybe got some color introduced to it by pushing my color picker this way, I can make a new layer, and I can fill this. This is the background color. I can hit Alt Backspace to fill with this color here. So if I'm happy with the results that I have with this layer up here, I need to merge this down. So I can select the layer and hit Control E, and it's going to ask me if I want to preserve that mask. I'll go ahead and preserve the mask, and you can see I've just changed the color of that layer by merging that down. I'll hit Save, or you can go to File, Save, and that's going to save over the top of this temporary file. You can see here that moves back and forth between ZBrush and Photoshop. So I'm just going to do Windows Tab, and I'm going to push this back into ZBrush. So I'm going to say re-enter ZBrush, and I can tell it to pick up now. So you saw the other one when we sent it over, it was drop now. Basically, it's taking the 3D model and putting it into kind of a 2D mode to send over to Photoshop, and then when you come back, you need to pick that up from the 2D mode and convert that paint information into the 3D model. So you can see what happened here. It only pushed through the front of the model and didn't go all the way through. That is because in our options here, if we do Zap Link, if I turn on this double-sided, now I hit drop now, and I update that like this. Now I'll just go ahead and make a new layer, and just to make sure there is some kind of difference, I'm going to lighten this up just a little bit like that, and then hit Alt Backspace to fill with this color here. And then I'll go ahead and merge this down. So I select this layer and hit Control E to merge down, and I'll preserve that mask. I'm going to save it, Control S, and then I'm going to hop back over to ZBrush, and I'm going to say re-enter ZBrush. You saw there's a little bit of a color change there now. So now I'm going to say pick up now, and let's take a look. It didn't get pushed all the way through the model. This is actually a bug that currently exists within the tool. So to fix that, we have to go down to Display Properties, and we have to turn double on for our model. So it's actually showing the front side of our model and drawing the back side of the model as well. So we'll do this one more time just to check and make sure everything's working as we would expect. So I'll say drop now. I'll update it, and again, just going to give it a little bit slight color change, just make sure there's some kind of difference there. I'll make a new layer, fill it, merge that down, tell it to preserve the mask, save, hop on over to ZBrush, re-enter ZBrush, say pick up now. And it's going to take a little bit of time to convert that. And you can see now it's pushed all the way through the model. There is some kind of a issue here with the side here. You can see it's kind of got a few little errors. I am using polypaint right now, and I have noticed that this tool does work a little bit better whenever you are using a texture map. So if you do have UVs on your model, it would be possible for you to go and say create a new texture from polypaint, and whatever this size is set here in the UV area, that's the size of the map that's going to be created whenever we create this. So if I wanted a 4096, I could click on this button. If I wanted 2048, click here. So I'll say new from polypaint, and you should see it's going to generate this new map for us that we can start taking a look at. So I'll go ahead and let's just do this from the side view just to have some kind of difference here. So I was just rotating, and then you can hold down Shift while you rotate to snap your camera position to 90-degree turns, so you get a nice front, side, back, top view. Let's go back to Document, Zap Link. We'll drop now, and that should send this on over to Photoshop. I'll tell it to update, and it's asking us to update because it's just using one temporary file, and every time we do this, sending back and forth, it needs to update that file. So if there's ever a problem, you have the opportunity in Photoshop to say, I don't want to update, and then maybe you can steal the work and save that off in another document. So let's go here. I'll push it more gray this time. I'll make a new layer, fill it, Control E to merge it down, preserve the mask, save it, hop on over to ZBrush, and it's going to ask me to re-enter ZBrush. I'll do that, and I'll tell it to pick up now. It'll take just a little bit of time, and it will go through this conversion process. And it looks like it takes maybe a little more time when we're actually using textures over polypaint. But I think you can see the results. I don't see kind of any of that stretching along some of the edges. So I did notice that is kind of an issue sometimes whenever you're using this tool with polypaint. So it's just something to take into consideration. I also wanted to show you how to fill your object with a custom material, a material that you want to use when you're poly painting. This Skin Shade 4 is actually a pretty good material to work with whenever you're poly painting or you're doing the Zap Link. Let me show you real quick here. Let's turn off the texture map, because there's two different ways that we can kind of work here. If we turn off the texture map, we're obviously just working with poly painting at that point, and then we could choose any one of these materials and we could fill the entire object with it. You just go and turn on M, and that stands for material, and make sure the RGB intensity is to 100%. You can say color fill object. Now it is possible that you could use two different materials, and if I put it on the standard brush, turn off Z add, I can actually paint with a material just kind of like how we were painting with polypaint. So this is a way that you could paint with two different materials. Like, you know, if I wanted the eyes to be a certain material and the body to be a different material, we could go ahead and do that. I believe in the newer versions of ZBrush, they've given the ability whenever you do a BPR render, you hit Shift R to invoke that. They're supposed to be giving you some sort of smoother transition between materials, because it is just like polypaint, you know, where basically each one of these polygons is given a color or a material, and sometimes the transitions between those things can be a little bit harsh. So I think they've built in some controls for that to make that look a little bit nicer. So yeah, I think that will render much better in these newer versions of ZBrush. So again, if I wanted to fill this entire object with this chrome material, I'll have the chrome material selected. I can go to color and say fill object, like that. This is what the Skin Shade 4 looks like. Color fill object this way. The one that I've been using is I've taken the Skin Shade 4 and then I've added a little bit of highlight to it, so I can say color fill object for that, and you can see it's got a little more highlight information along this edge, and that's the material that I kind of built and have been using for this different poly painting things. You'll probably notice, let's put this on this red wax material again and say color fill object. If you're poly painting, you can see materials on this, and you can see it change. If you ever want to get rid of the material information, you can put on this flat color material, which just sits right here, and say color fill object. And then now whenever you click on a material, it will automatically update it with that particular material, just because it doesn't have one assigned to it. So whatever's available over here is going to grab that and it's going to throw that on your model. Okay, so that's how that's going to work for the polypaint mode. I'll say color fill object again and just fill it with that shader. Just one second. But you may notice if we turn the texture on, the material information doesn't change anymore. So like if I put on this red wax material and I say color and I say fill object with the material, it's not going to change. In the texture area, it's got its own place to fill with either a material or a color or a fill gradient. So if I want to say fill material, I have to do it over here if I'm going to use texture maps. Same with fill color. If I want to do that, I could hit fill color and it's going to fill with whatever this color is that I've got selected over here. So if I wanted to start off with a darker color here, I'll put it on the Skin Shade 4 material and say fill material. So here's kind of my base that I'm going to be working with. So now we're all set up. You'll know how to change materials and how to work with Zap Link. I guess I will just talk a little bit more about a few different things, maybe some things that might kind of trip you up when you're using this tool. So let's see, if I send this over, let's say document and say Zap Link, and I'll do drop now. I'm going to turn on fade this time and turn off double-sided. Say drop now. Should send that on over to Photoshop for us. if I go ahead and make a new layer, let's act as if we're going to use multiple layers, right? So let's say I paint some different colors on here. I'm going to put on my brush. I'm just going to do some hard edge lines kind of like this. And I'll do another color down below that. And below that layer, I'll do another color as well. Okay, so I got some different colors to work with. Normally, if I'm working with multiple layers, I like to merge all these things down. Hit Control E, so I select the top one, hold down Shift to add to the selection here. Hit Control E, and that will merge whatever I've got selected. That'll give me one layer that sits right above this layer 1. And then I can just select this layer and hit Control E, and that will drop that down. I'll tell it to preserve that. You can see this change here, and then I will go ahead and save that. Control S, and then I'm going to hop on over to ZBrush. Let's go here, and it's going to tell me to re-enter ZBrush. Sometimes, like if something happened, maybe some kind of error, you might see this other little button, and it says, no change detected. Return to external editor. If you return to the external editor, it gives you a chance to, maybe fix something that went wrong. Like that, and then you would just save it again, and then hop on over to ZBrush and say re-enter ZBrush. And I found that, if there's any kind of problem, usually that will kind of fix things if I go back into the editor and resave. So I'll tell to pick up now. Notice that I've got fade turned on, so we saw what would happen before, where it would just take this paint and kind of push it straight back through the model. But if we have fade turned on, and I say pick up now, it's going to take just a little bit for it to generate that texture. Then your cursor should turn red with the brush mark around it. Okay, so you should see with that fade turned on, it's going to push the paint only so far, and then it's going to try to fade this out along the outer edges of the model at that point. So you can see it didn't push through right in this area, and it kind of faded this off in here. So that does work. My suggestion to you would be to kind of maybe avoid painting around the edges. So like if we sent this thing back over, I say document Zap Link, say drop now. I'll tell it to update this. Basically what I would do is let's pick this color here, hit OK. I'm actually going to turn off this shading so you can see this is just purely the color that we're working with. Hit OK. So basically if I was painting on this, I would try to avoid really painting over the edges. I would just kind of work in this area like this. Okay, then I would save that. You can see I was just painting directly on that layer 1 that time. Then hop on over to ZBrush. Tell it to re-enter ZBrush. Say pick up now. It might take just a second. Okay, now that it's applied the paint, we can move around. But you can see I can get pretty good results this way. And basically I kind of work from one vantage point, and then you're going to need to rotate your camera, and then you're going to have to, send this new shot over to Photoshop. So say document Zap Link, let's say drop now, and then tell it to update. And again, I'll hide this shaded layer so I can just pick out whatever this pure color is of this here at that point. and then just continue to paint and kind of work your way around the model this way until you kind of have hit all the different areas that you need to for your model. And of course, I'm just painting with you know, some flat color here, but there's no reason why you couldn't introduce shading. You basically have all your tools inside of Photoshop. You can basically do anything that you want, and you're just using this as a temporary place to hold this viewpoint that you've got that ZBrush is sent over. And then once that work is done, then you're just going to be pushing those paint strokes on over to ZBrush to have it applied to your model in 3D. So for me, this is kind of like the best of both worlds. I get to use ZBrush and I get to use Photoshop, and really with this combination, there isn't anything that I couldn't paint. You know, I could get whatever look that I'm going for. But again, that also has to do with, you know, kind of your skill level inside of Photoshop. You know, so maybe you'll feel more comfortable just painting directly inside of ZBrush. So if that's the case, then that's a workflow that would probably work better for you. But if you've been using Photoshop for quite some time, this will be a nice setup for you. So let's hit save on that, and Windows tab back on over to ZBrush, re-enter ZBrush. Tell it to pick up now. Okay, you can see those paint strokes have been applied. I was going to show you also, you know, what if you wanted to try to steal some of the work that you've been doing on the one side of the model and push it over to the other side of the model. If your model is nice and symmetrical like this, you could send this over, and let's say document, say Zap Link, drop now. It's going to send this on over to Photoshop. And then from here, if I turn off the shading, I can see exactly what I have here. I could just, I'll just make a marquee, so I'll hit the M hotkey or select over here. Then just select like half of the face, copy that, and I'll paste it into a new layer. And I can say edit, transform, flip horizontal. And then at that point, I could hit V to put in my move tool, and actually I'm going to hit undo. I did not paste that. Copy, paste. Need to make sure I'm in another layer here. Edit, transform, flip horizontal, and then I'm on my move tool, so I'll push this over like this, and I could just nudge this just a little bit. Here's where the shading can really help out, because it can help you determine where that paint should be applied like this. And I'll just put it on my eraser tool, and I believe this, I've got just like an airbrush kind of an eraser. It's nice and soft, so I'll erase that out in this kind of seam that you see here. Then I can just flatten this thing down, tell it to preserve, save, hop on over to ZBrush, re-enter ZBrush, say pick up now, and it'll go through that process of applying the paint. Okay, that's been applied, and so now you can see that I've got most of everything from this side over here. But because of, you know, some of the options that we use, the fade and things like that, it's not going to be exact. So now's probably a good time to be talking about saving the work that we're doing. You can see every time we do this projection, it updates this map over here. But this map just lives on, you know, on the model that we're working with. It's not really part of the program's textures like what we see over here. So if we want to save the work, we have to hit this clone texture button, and it'll throw it in here with the regular textures that we have. Now at that point we can hit export, and we can put that somewhere and give it a name. I'll just leave it whatever the name is. It's going to give it the name of the object that I was working on. So I'm going to throw it on the desktop real quick, and it might give you something about material information being embedded in there. You can just say yes for that. So I'm going to go on over to Photoshop, and I'll say File, Open. So let's go to the desktop, and let's find this this file that we just made and open this thing up. Now if you've set your UVs up in a way, I like to try to do this as much as possible. If you've set your UVs up to be symmetrical, you could easily steal information from one side and paste it on the other. This is something else to talk about. The texture, you can see, is probably upside. It's going to be upside down from what you're accustomed to, maybe by what you've set up in your UVs. For whatever reason, ZBrush has their UV coordinates set up in a different way than a lot of other programs. So you're going to have to either flip it. You can go edit, image rotation, and you can say flip canvas vertical, and that'll flip it for you. So if you want to work in Photoshop this way, you're going to do that. And now I can just go ahead and maybe make a lasso, and I will steal this part of this, copy this, paste it. So I got a new layer here. Edit, transform, flip horizontal, and then I'll try to move this thing over. If I take my opacity and drop it down just a little bit, I can kind of get a better idea of exactly where I need to kind of move this thing. So I've got it on my move tool, and I want to line it up. Looks about right about there. So I can drop that down even more, kind of make sure where I'm at. So I might move this thing over just a little bit, and then I can put on my eraser tool and then just erase out just a little bit to kind of blend that a little bit better, like that. So I can hit Control E and merge that down. I know somewhere on here I've got my my shoulders that I was painting. Let's move this over here just a little bit. So here's the shoulder that I painted, and if I wanted to steal that, I could steal that part, copy, paste, Control V, and then my shoulder, the other one here is right here. So I can go Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal, move this over. I'll also put the opacity down so I can try to line this thing up. If I tap Z and zoom in, and for some reason my hotkeys, whenever I've been using Photoshop lately, keep switching on me whenever I go to a different tool. Not sure what's going on with that, but I've been having to manually use some of these things. So I'll put the opacity back up on this and take a look at it and make sure that I don't have any hard edges from where I've copied and pasted. So I'll just tap E for my eraser and blend some of this out. Hit Control E. Now I could actually save right over the top of that file, or we could start working in a way that would build us up different versions of that texture. So I'll do 001, save that, then hop on over to ZBrush, and to get that texture in the program we need to come here and say Import, and go to the desktop, date modified. So here's my new version that I made. Open that, and you can see this is going to put that texture here in this slot. So I already know that I'm going to, whoa, accidentally clicked on this thing to rotate. I know that I'm going to have to take this texture and flip it vertically to have it work correctly inside of ZBrush. So I can go to texture and say flip V, and that'll flip the texture vertical. You can see it switched there. Now to get that new change applied to my model, I have to come over here to this texture map area and click here, and then click on this new texture that I want to use. So you can see it's going to update for me based off the changes that I made. And so this has got the eye working here. I must have introduced something, there's a shading difference that's going on right here, so I could fix that, but I've stole some of the paint here and here. Another thing is to make sure, I'd like to turn on this anti-laced texture that gets rid of any kind of stair-stepping effect that you might get. So that's basically the workflow. We could always take this and push this to polypaint. We could always say polypaint from texture at this point. So now you've got a little workflow to work inside of a paint program, push these changes back and forth between ZBrush and that paint program. And then also, if you want to go back to polypaint, you can convert this stuff to polypaint, and then if you do more work on polypaint and want to convert that to texture, it's really up to you how you kind of want to work at that point. Now that you know the rules for using Zap Link, I'm going to go ahead and put this video in a time-lapse mode and go ahead and finish out the texture for this this statue thing here. The look that I'll be kind of going for is some kind of rustic, old, maybe kind of metal, and that's going to require a different material than what I'm using currently. So there'll be another video where we create a material that's going to work with these colors that we're painting, but for now I'm just going to be worried about painting the color map.